Shalom, Hamster Suburb Synagogue, and welcome to our Tuesday night Torah and the Hot Issues. Tonight, I want to talk to you about Hallel with or without a bracha on Yom Haatzmaut. But before we do, this evening is Yom HaZikaron, the day that we remember all of the fallen soldiers who gave their lives in battle for the state of Israel, for Am Yisrael, not only in the state of Israel, but our brothers and sisters fell for our sakes, for Jews around the world, and tonight we remember them. Tomorrow night, Thursday, will be Yom Haatzmaut, and we will be celebrating Israel's independence. Now, the perennial question is, when we recite Hallel, do we recite with a bracha or without a bracha? Now, different people do different things, and sometimes it's tempting to say, well, I'm more Zionist than you, or you don't understand, you're saying God's name in vain. But unless we really understand the issues, why we should recite Hallel with or without a bracha, then we're simply being intolerant of the other person without understanding what the logic is behind the different perspectives. Some of the ideas this evening are going to be derived from the writings of Rabbi Eliezer Melamed. Now, I want to point out, before Pesach, we did a presentation with some of the teachings of Rabbi Eliezer Melamed on kashering in the kitchen, and Facebook Live was running closed captioning on the presentation, and it came up as Rabbi Muhammad. Thank you to a couple of you who sent me the screenshots. I assure you it is not Rabbi Muhammad, and it is Rabbi Melamed that we will be learning from this evening. So the first question that we need to ascertain is, how do we establish a Yom Tov? Now, Yom Haatzmaut in the religious Zionist community is a Yom Tov. What does that mean? Practically, there are ramifications. It's in the middle of the Omer, and yet we have live music. Many people take haircuts and shave. I remember at one point I had a Haredi chavrusa. I walked into the Beis Medrash, and I was a little scraggly that day, and he says, I can't believe it. He says, if you were in a Hesed yeshiva, you will be thrown out for being a disbeliever. Today's Yom Haatzmaut. Why have you not shaved today? So it's a Yom Tov. But how do we simply make a Yom Tov that overrides the Omer? Who gets to decide that? So it's based, the Gemara says, on a Kal V'chomer. So it's a Gemara in Megillah, Daf Yudalid Amud Aleph, page 14a, that derives Purim via a Kal V'chomer, an a fortiori argument. So the Kal V'chomer goes like this. The Torah says that we have a Yom Tov that celebrates our freedom from slavery. We were slaves, then we became free men, and therefore we have a Yom Tov. If that's the case, says the Gemara, then how much more so when we were saved for genocidal annihilation in the time of Purim, we were saved from death to life, then we must celebrate that as a Yom Tov. It's deduced by a fortiori argument. The Ritva says the same thing applies to Hanukkah. Hanukkah, we could have been annihilated in that battle. Yes, sure, it started for various religion versus Hellenism reasons, but we were fighting a battle and we could have been wiped out, and we weren't wiped out. And therefore, since we were saved from physical annihilation, therefore it is a Yom Tov by virtue of the Kal V'chomer that if Pesach is a Yom Tov, when we were only taken from slavery to freedom, then when we were taken from death to life, then definitely the Torah would say we should establish a Yom Tov. Now, parenthetically, what's important always to note when it comes to Pesach is that Pesach is not just a slavery to freedom Yom Tov. It also happens to be an emancipation from genocide. Remember, Pharaoh would throw the babies into the Nile. It's often forgotten. We think, oh, we were slaves, now we're free. No, babies were thrown into the Nile, they were drowned. And that's why the final redemption came when the Egyptians were drowned, midah keneged midah, because God punished them measure for measure. But on the whole, for most of our nation, it wasn't about genocide, it was about slavery. So slavery and a little, bit of physical insecurity, sadly, tragically, and that becomes freedom physically, versus Purim and Hanukkah, where we are saved from death to life. So our sages say, obviously, the Torah would say that should be a Yom Tov. Now, the Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer Pressburg, 19th century, says that therefore not only is Purim and Hanukkah a rabbinic enactment, no, it's considered a Torah law because it has Torah origins, because it's derived from a Torah principle. The only thing is, in contrast with Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Shmini Atzeres, the Torah doesn't tell us how to commemorate and celebrate other Yom Tovim that are established. So our sages, though, tell us that on Purim there are 4 special mitzvahs: reading the Megillah, Mishlach Manot, Matanot Levyonim, and the Mishta, the feast. On Hanukkah, we light the candles. Those are established by the rabbis as forms of commemoration for the Yom Tov, but the fact that it should be a Yom Tov, that has its roots in the Torah. In fact, Rabbi Moshe Alashkar, 16th century Egypt, says that it's not only about Purim, the original. We find throughout our history there are community-specific Purims. There is a Purim Frankfurt, a Purim Tveria, other places that had unique salvations, and those communities made that day each year a commemoration, a Yom Tov, to the extent, says Rabbi Moshe Alashkar, that if you were from one of those communities and you moved to another community, then you would continue to celebrate that Yom Tov on the day, even though you weren't in the same community still. I think about the Yom Tov of the 14th of Kislev. Now, I'll give you a moment to think about what the 14th of Kislev is. So the 14th of Kislev, 2019, is what I like to refer to as Purim Anglia. It was the day, the 12th of December 2019, that Anglo Jewry was saved from potential, I'm not going to say annihilation, but our lives would have become very difficult. Judaism, Jewish practice, Jewish identity would have had terrible ramifications had a certain person come to power. We don't know for sure, but that was the assumption. So much so that the chief rabbi was willing to stick his neck out, something that chief rabbis don't normally do, and Yasher Koach for making that political statement. But it was more than just a political statement. It was a statement that saved us, saved our entire community. And so that's Purim Anglia. And perhaps we should be commemorating, celebrating the 14th of Kislev every year. But that's the basis of Yom Haatzmaut. Yom Haatzmaut, the Jewish people, were saved from annihilation with the establishment of the State of Israel. The State of Israel gave us a security, a sense of well-being that we haven't had for 2,000 years. And if that's not reason to celebrate any less than Purim or Hanukkah, what is? So if we believe that, the Yom Haatzmaut granted us those freedoms and that security, then it becomes rooted in the Torah itself that Yom Haatzmaut should be a Yom Tov. In fact, Rabbi Mishulem Roth, about whom Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook declared that after the passing of his father, Rav Kook, Rav Roth was the Gadol Hador. So listen to what Rav Roth says in his response to Kol Mavaser. He says that the 5th of Iyar is a Yom Tov by virtue of the fact that day was chosen by the Chavrei Knesset, those who were elected to the Israeli parliament by the majority of the Jewish people. Even though it may be a secular body, since the majority of the Jewish people elected them to make decisions on behalf of the national populace, that has spiritual impact. And he says, in addition to that, you had the chief rabbinate who stood alongside them, representing the majority of rabbis in the country, and therefore those two who chose the 5th of Iyar as the day of Yom Tov, of Yom Haatzmaut, that takes spiritual significance. So once we've established that Yom Haatzmaut is a Yom Tov, why is it that we would recite Hallel on that day? Well, let's again go back to our original rabbinic or rabbinically rooted rabbinic extensions of the Torah law of Yom Tov, Hanukkah and Purim. So Purim, the Talmud tells us, the Megillah is the equivalent of reciting Hallel. But Hanukkah, we recite Hallel. Right? Remember, Hanukkah happens later than Purim, and yet our rabbis institute post-Bible that we should recite Hallel on Hanukkah. What's the basis of their enactment? Well, it's a pasuk in the book of Ezra when we returned to Israel for the second Commonwealth, for the building of the second temple. The verse says that the people turned to God in song and Hallel, praise. So based on this notion that when we came back we recited Hallel, our sages say that when we want to give thanks to God, this is the formula. We recite Hallel. And anytime we will be giving thanks, the right way to do it is by reciting Hallel. If Hanukkah, the Yom Tov, is established with Hallel, similarly, Yom Haatzmaut should be a Yom Tov that is established with Hallel. In fact, says Rabbi Melamed, there was a time that we failed to do so, and it had terrible consequences. When was that? So King Chizkiyahu was a righteous king. At one point, the city of Jerusalem was surrounded by the armies of Sancheiriv. You'll recall Sancheiriv was the Assyrian conqueror who had wiped out the northern kingdom, the 10 lost tribes. So he had made it into the southern kingdom of Judah, and he had surrounded Jerusalem. And King Chizkiyahu, King Hezekiah, was so distraught that he was bedridden. And then in the middle of the night, God sent a miracle, and Sancheriv's armies were vanquished by some miraculous force. They disappeared overnight, and Jerusalem was saved. King Chizkiyahu thought, wow, what a miracle, this is amazing. But listen to what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, had King Chizkiyahu at that point sang a song of thanksgiving, turned his eyes heavenward, and showed his appreciation publicly for the miracle that God hath wrought, he would have become Mashiach. But because he failed to do so, he missed the opportunity to usher in the Messianic era. That's the Gemara in Sanhedrin, page 94a, Tzadi Daled Amud Aleph. Rabbi Melamed says, if we miss this opportunity of Yom Haatzmaut, this huge miracle, it's what we are called Kfuye Tova. We are ungrateful, ingrates. We have to acknowledge the miracle. You see a miracle that God has made for our nation, we are obligated to acknowledge that by reciting Hallel every year in commemoration of that fact. So let's turn to our question of Hallel with or without a bracha. Let's start why we might not make a bracha. And really, this was the initial thoughts of the Chief Rabbinate Council. When the State of Israel was established in 1948, the Chief Rabbinate Council convened and decided that Hallel should be recited every year on Yom Haatzmaut, but without a bracha. What is the basis for not making a bracha? So 5 reasons were offered. Number 1, the only time we recite Hallel with a bracha is when a miracle happens for our entire nation. Here it wasn't everybody. Most Jews didn't live in Israel. There was a small proportion of Jewish people living in Israel whose lives were at stake, and their lives were saved. And so it's a wonderful event, it's a wonderful day, but since it didn't happen to most of us, therefore it doesn't warrant proper Hallel with a bracha. We'll get to respond to some of these soon, but this is the contention. Number 2, it was an incomplete salvation. Think about it. When Ben Gurion stood up in the Binyanei Ha'omah and he said, we are establishing, it's the 5th of Iyar, we're establishing the state of Israel. Israel was in the middle of a war. There was no peace and security. Some would argue the security didn't happen until 1967. Others would argue that we're even not there yet. So since it's an incomplete salvation, the argument was that we can't recite Hallel with a full dedication, therefore it's without a bracha. Number 3, This one's a little, I would say controversial. It might come across as a little patronizing. So I apologize in advance. These are not my words. These are the thoughts of certain rabbis on the Chief Rabbinic Council in 1948, who said that, let's face it, Israel is not a religious society. For the most part, it's a secular society. So from a spiritual perspective, the situation or the salvation was far from desirable. So how could we be reciting Hallel for something that we consider far from ideal? Number 4, there were those that suggested that the only time we recite Hallel is if we have a supernatural miracle, like the oil burned for 8 days. Now, I know that some of the historians amongst our viewers are saying, well, when did we find historically the appearance of the oil? Let's put that aside for a moment. All right, let's assume that the miracle of the oil happened right then and there, and that's when Hallel was declared. So maybe there needs to be a supernatural miracle. Maybe that's one of the reasons why Purim, that was built into nature, there is no Hallel. When do we recite Hallel? When we have a supernatural miracle that we can see with our very eyes. And the state of Israel, to religious people, certainly looks supernatural. To irreligious people, to non-believers, it was, we just lucked out. We had some good army at the right time. It was a close call, but we made it. But there was nothing supernatural about it. Right? Just an idea, but an idea to consider. Number 5. What's the right day to recite Hallel? When did the miracle of the state of Israel happen? Some would argue that it was Chavtet November, the 29th of November, 1947, when the United Nations voted that there should be a petition plan in British Mandate Palestine between a state for Jews and a state for what became known later as Palestinian Arabs. And so maybe the 29th of November is the key date. Maybe the Balfour Declaration is the key date. What makes the 5th of Iyar so clearly the date to establish a Yom Tov that would warrant a bracha using Hashem's name? So indeed, it was voted at the establishment of the State of Israel that Hallel should be recited without a bracha. And that's why we find, until today, many machzorim, certainly machzorim dating from then, and many people who will recite Hallel but without a bracha, because that's what they did, that's what their parents and grandparents did, even though Yom Haatzmaut, it's a Yom Tov. And yet, based on this initial decision of the chief rabbin of Israel, this was and remains the minhag, the correct minhag amongst those who have that practice, and a minhag that should not be derided or questioned because it's a bona fide practice. Now let's look at the other side. What then happened was, it wasn't until after the Yom Kippur War, not after the 1967 Six-Day War, it was after the Yom Kippur War that the Chief Rabbinic Council reconvened and said, it's time that we recited Hallel with a bracha. Maybe after 1967, we failed to show our appreciation to God, and that's why 1973 was such a close call, and it's time that we now declared that the state of Israel is an amazing supernatural miracle, and we must recite Hallel with a bracha. Rav Goren, who was the chief rabbi at the time, said that now we have more Jews, far more Jews in the state of Israel, in the land of Israel, than we had back in 1948. There is a victory here of expanded land, expanded security for our people, buffer zones. And nevertheless, not everybody agreed. For example, Rav Ovadia Yosef. Rav Ovadia did not say that it's not a Yom Tov. He simply said it's not enough to warrant Hallel with a bracha. Hallel without a bracha, yes, but not Hallel with a bracha. Those who argued for Hallel with a bracha said the security of Israel is not just about Israelis or Jews living in Israel. It's about Jews worldwide. All of us are affected. Our peace and security, our sense of security is bolstered by the fact that we have a state of Israel. It's not just about a portion. It's now, if not in 1940, but certainly post-67, It's now something that we are all riding on, we are all part and parcel of. I might say parenthetically, I don't want to sound like I am casting any shadow on any of this, because I certainly believe that Hallel should be recited with a bracha, and the state of Israel is a blessing for all Jews. I will say that there are concerns. In some ways, think of our kids on campus whose safety and security is threatened, or at least they perceive that it's threatened by virtue of attacks on the state of Israel. So it's complicated, no doubt. The relationship is complex, but I think overall, everybody would agree that the security of the state of Israel grants security to Jews everywhere. They also said, the Chief Rabbinate Council, now this also might be a little more controversial, they said that the Jews in Israel are the voice and representatives of Jews around the world. And so when the Jews of Israel have something that happens to them, it's something that happens to everybody simply by virtue of them being the Jews of Israel. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. May or may not be true, but that was the argument that was made. What about the fact that Yom Haatzmaut was an incomplete miracle? We were still in the middle of a battle. Maybe we still don't have safety and security and peace in Israel. So to that, the rabbis responded, well, the fact is Hanukkah was not a complete miracle either. Yes, we managed to keep the Greeks at bay for some time, but it wasn't long before they were back, and it was a short-lived miracle that, yes, saved us right then and there, but wasn't anything permanent, enduring by any means. And so that may not be a necessary prerequisite. How about the fact that Hanukkah we celebrate a supernatural miracle of the oil? Well, that may be true, but Hallel was established first and foremost because we won the battle. Right? The oil, miracle of the oil was secondary, it suggested, and so the battle, the victory for our physical lives, our physical security, that's what warranted the Hallel. What about the fact that so many Jews died? Tonight's Yom HaZikaron, we remember the fallen soldiers. And can you imagine? Rabbis are standing up at the beginning of the establishment of the State of Israel saying, we're going to say Hallel. And every bereaved parent says, Hallel? I just lost my children. And they're like, wait, you're right. Maybe we shouldn't say Hallel. Maybe people have died. And so it's not a cause for joy. So to that, the rabbi said in round 2, after the Yom Kippur War, you know what, during the battles of Hanukkah, many Jews died as well. That didn't mean that we said, okay, we're just going to be in a continual state of mourning. No. Yes, there were sacrifices that were made, but Hanukkah is a miracle, and we're going to establish a Yom Tov with Hallel, with a bracha. So what changed? I want to share with you an idea from Rabbi Shmuel Katz, who brings this in his Sefer about Yom Haatzmaut. What happened at the beginning, why the rabbi said there shouldn't be a Hallel with a bracha, but later they changed their minds. So one idea that he brings was that the Chazon Ish was opposed to Hallel with a bracha. Maybe Hallel in general, but certainly Hallel with a bracha, saying Hashem's name. And it was felt by the religious Zionist rabbis at the time that machlokas in the Orthodox community should be minimized. In the observant from community was such a minority of the Jewish people that if there was going to be a split, a division based on something that shouldn't be, this should be a cause for joy, not a cause for division. If it's going to be a cause for division, then rather not go there. And so just based on that, Rabbi Katz says, that was the reason why Hallel without a bracha was the decision at the time. Finally, let me end off with a story from Rav Shari Yosef Cohen. Very powerful idea. He says, my father would always say to me, he says, from the time of the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, every time Yom Haatzmaut rolled around, I wanted so much to recite Hallel with a bracha, and I believed that Hallel should be recited with a bracha. And yet I couldn't and I didn't. Why couldn't I not do so? Why did I not do so? Because what is the bracha that one makes over Hallel? Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu likro et ha'Hallel. God sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to read the Hallel. What was it? V'tzivanu. When were we commanded? The only way that we can be commanded to do anything is either it says in the Torah or the rabbis, based on something in the Torah, derive. If the rabbis never commanded us to recite Hallel the bracha, then there is no precondition to be able to satisfy our recitation of Hallel with the bracha. And if that's lacking, then there is no Vetzivano. And without the Vetzivano, and they commanded us, then I cannot recite Hallel. And with that, each year, with that introduction each year, he would mourn the lack of complete simcha and then gird his loins and recite Hallel with the greatest simcha that one could imagine. May we be zocha, may we merit to all recite Hallel very soon with a bracha, with no contention whatsoever, with Biat Goel Tzedek, the final and complete redemption, speedily in our days. Wishing everybody a solemn, meaningful Yom HaZikaron and Chag Atzmaut Sameach. All the very best.